Hello everybody, my name is Gabriel Fairman, and today we're going to be talking about machine translation post-editing and how it impacts the financial aspect of a translation agency. So when we talk about machine translation post-editing, or in short, MTPE, let's start just by breaking apart what these different concepts mean. Machine translation refers to any time that you process text for translation through a given engine. This could be statistical, rule-based, neural, regardless of the kind of engine, whether it's Google, Microsoft, AWS, putting a document in and you're getting a document out. That's machine translation. You have further sophistications of machine translation where you can train an engine or tune an engine. Again, from a very basic perspective, tuning an engine involves actually tweaking the rules and algorithms within that given engine, whereas training it involves the kind of data that you feed it so that it works within those algorithms. Again, just very oversimplifying here, but just making sure that we have lots of variance around machine translation. It's far from being a monolith, but it's this basic idea where you have documents coming in language and the machine translation engine producing outputs without any human interference, thereby machine translated in any number of languages. Okay, so now that we've established what machine translation looks like, let's talk about PE, or post-editing. When we talk about post-editing, we're really just referring to the process that any human being engages in to make sure that they're reading over the machine translation propositions and adjusting them as necessary to make sure that they're viable translations. The challenge with this post-editing is that it means many different things for different people. For some people, post-editing could refer to the process of receiving a machine translation and making sure that it's perfect. For other people, post-editing is a much lighter form of editing. It's really just avoiding blatant mistakes, blatant mistranslations, but really not focusing on maximizing the quality output of that given translation. For our purposes, we're going to take a more agnostic perspective. Any kind of edits that are being made to a text after it gets translated by a machine engine, that is what people refer to MTPE. Now, the reason why MTPE is super important for a translation agency and translation buyers is because it has the promise of enhanced efficiency, right? If you think about it from a very simplistic perspective, if I get a file that's 2,000 words long and I have to type out each and every word in my translation process, it's very likely that I'm going to take a lot longer than if I'm just reviewing what a machine has, let's say, pre-translated for me. I say it's very likely because it's not always the case. It's often, doing work with MTPE can often be very misleading, very complex, a lot more painful than actually translating from scratch, because with MTPE, you're looking always for errors that haven't been produced by a human being, much less a highly capable human being, which means that sometimes you get super well translated sentences, and sometimes you're dealing with mistakes that are just buried in the text. They maybe sound plausible, but there's something inherently wrong with them. There could be all kinds of problems, from cultural misappropriations to incorrect expressions to literal translations, often even embarrassing mistakes. So the MTPE process, even though it promises a lot of efficiency, it doesn't necessarily always deliver that kind of efficiency. And to be clear, the MTPE process, it's known, it varies significantly across different subject matters. So maybe it's going to be exceptionally good in finance, but terrible in marketing. And I'm just giving a few examples that may or may not be true. I'm just distinguishing between these subject matters. Same with languages. Maybe with a high resource language like English into German, it may perform really well, but English into Urdu, it may not perform nearly as well because of the lack of training data and the amount of attention devoted from machine learners into these machine translation algorithm. So the challenge, the basic benefit of machine translation is that it delivers this promise of greater efficiency. The challenge is that MTPE is ungovernable in the sense that I can give you a file that has been translated by machine translation. I can tell you, can you please perform MTPE? And you'll be sure. And maybe you'll spend countless hours on that file and essentially making sure that it's perfect, flawless, according to your standard. Whereas maybe you can send me that same file and you can tell me, Gabriel, can you MTPE this? And they'll just spend a few minutes glossing over the file, making a few minor changes here and there, and just say it's good enough, right? And as much as you add very specific instructions instructions to what to do during the MTPE process. Those instructions, they can be interpreted very differently by different people. They're very hard to ensure that they're being followed because it all relies on human interpretation, human review, human evaluation, which are complex to scale and standardize by definition. So what we really want to establish is that MTPE had an intense promise of enhanced efficiency, but never really solved anything. And ultimately what happened was a lot of translation agencies and translation buyers started to pre-process translations in machine translation engines, sending out what used to be translation work as MTPE work, essentially paying less for the same kind of service. And like I said, in many cases, paying less for even something that actually will require more mental bandwidth to solve, because there's this false idea that by not having to type words, the work is going to go by faster. It can often be a lot more problematic to look for specific errors buried in a text than working from scratch with full confidence that you're relying on the fullness of your human intellectual capability. So MTPE, very high promise, iffy delivery, and I understand that MTPE has made especially translators very calloused around the idea of technology. In my opinion, it's a blatant example of improperly adopted and implemented technology. Again, could be a lot better, but ultimately was mostly seen as a way to cut corners, to get the same work for less. Now, augmented translations come along the way, and augmented translations, they work kind of similarly to MTPE, but very differently as well. Let's talk about how they're similar. Well, augmented translations are similar in BWX in the sense that, for instance, you have something called context-sensitive translate. The context-sensitive translate is operating from a very high-level perspective, very similarly to a machine translation engine. But when you look at the details, the context-sensitive translation is looking at contextual probabilities from several different context sources. A machine translation, say from Microsoft or DeepL, is one of those context sources. The glossary is another context sources. Low-level syntactical matches, like a 10 to 20% match that's normally not offered to a human being just because it's very distant from what's being translated, that could be a context. And most importantly, the context-sensitive translation is capable of inferring semantics from these contexts. So it operates much more sophisticated in a pure syntactical search. The other key difference is that in the augmented translation scenario, it's a continuous dialogue between the translator and the engine. So if I make a change to a given segment, that change isn't just going to be stored and siloed in a translation memory. That change is going to become contextual instruction for future segments that are going to be offered to me. If I add a term to the glossary, similarly. If I change a term to the glossary, similarly. So one of the most frustrating things for me in a machine translation post-editing process, for instance, is having to change the same thing over and over and over again. Having to work inorganically, because I know that from an efficiency purpose, if I find an error in a segment, chances are that it's best for me to have a global find and replace for that error potentially throughout the entire file before having to realize by the third time I'm implementing the same change that it's going to happen recurrently throughout the file. So the beauty of the context-sensitive translation is that while it seems on the surface very similar to MTPE, it's operating in a very different paradigm. It's operating in a dialogical way with you as the translator. It's learning from your choices. It's getting better and more in tune with your style, with your diction, with your tone, with your syntax. And overall, it becomes a far less stressful experience. It becomes more enjoyable. And it's also fairly easy to measure because in this case, you're not working with random MT that could be very good and could be very bad. You're working with contextualized information that's a lot more stable, a lot more predictable, and a lot more aligned with your preferences and style. The other thing about the context-sensitive paradigm, or the augmented translation paradigm, is that you're also, in addition to the context-sensitive translation, you're also offered additional semantic verifications. For instance, BWX translation smells. That's able to pick up on certain errors that previous QA checkers were just completely unable to. It's able to pick up on things from a mistranslation, to an omission, to an addition, to a misspelling, to a cultural misappropriation, to gender bias, to over slanginess in terminology, to inappropriate tone, excess formality. Semantic verification is something very powerful, and it's working like a brake. And most importantly, in an augmented translation scenario, you can work with the premise that edit distance is a much better representation of effort than in an MTPE scenario. So edit distance, just to recap, is the number of edits that you need to make in a given sentence to transform it from machine translation generated as to yours. If you just confirm something that the machine translation provided you with, that means the edit distance is 0. If you changed significantly, maybe the edit distance now is 20%, and it can grow all the way to 100%, meaning that you completely rewrote the sentence. So the edit distance is a measure of effort. Now, in the previous machine translation scenario, there was so much work that had to be performed as far as inspecting each and every sentence and looking for all of these hidden problems and errors that often the edit distance of 0 didn't represent that there was very little work done. Quite the contrary. Sometimes there was a lot of research performed. Sometimes there was a lot of cross-referencing that was necessary. In the augmented translation scenario, a lot of this greater linguistic groundwork is performed by the augmentation itself. So any sentence that's proposed to a translator is by default or by definition a much more viable semantic and syntactical proposition than anything that was previously coming from machine translation. So what this enables is a process that's more focused on turning something good to great rather than working with something in the MTPE scenario that's sometimes good, sometimes awful, to okay. It's hard to work with okay. It's very hard to measure that. It's very hard to be happy with that. It's very hard to derive any kind of satisfaction from that work. Myself, when I work with MTPE, I've never really enjoyed it. But when I work with augmented translations, it tends to be a very enjoyable process because I can feel during a translation process how the engine is learning from me, how it's aligning to what I think, to how I work, and overall diminishing not only the edit distance, but also the time that I need to go over a segment and make sure that I'm happy with. So when we think about all of this scenario, augmented translations, in my opinion, clearly opened the door to a much improved paradigm of MTPE. Now we're talking about a different kind of way of interacting with machine processed text. There's machine learning involved, there's contextualization, there's large language models involved. It's a much richer and more sophisticated process. Now, as far as challenges go, this is very far from being a perfect solution. The main problem, in my opinion, is that it's still going to be challenging to connect edit distance to actual cognitive effort. And it's even harder to connect cognitive effort to translation quality. Just to explain exactly what I mean, maybe I'm a very minimalistic editor and I'm able to just make the right amount of changes to every single segment, just the minimal amount of changes to make them sound just right. And that means that my edit distance is going to be very low. Maybe my cognitive effort is going to be very low, but my translation quality may be very high. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, maybe I'm just very unhappy with anything that I see that's different than my own way of expressing things, and I'm just erasing everything and I'm typing everything from scratch. I'm going to have very high edit distance. Maybe because of that as well, I'm going to have immense cognitive effort. But because I'm rewriting everything from scratch, there's a very high probability that I'm also introducing errors that were not even present in the augmented scenario to begin with. So in order to arrive at a paradigm or a framework that's fair for all parties involved, there's a lot of research that needs to go on, because even though in BWX, for instance, you can establish your own parameters for net rates, which means the calculating matrix that you use to pair a log file with the actual word count that you want to pay any given work in the engine for, even though you have that flexibility, we're very far as an industry to establish common denominators as to what makes sense. What makes sense for just rereading a feed coming from a machine translation? Is it 50%? Is it 70%? Is it the full word rate just for reading it and confirming it? When should you pay more and how much more? And if we don't have those answers clearly laid out, even for machine translation, how about for in an augmented scenario? What makes sense to go over an augmented feed to confirm it? And also, the other thing to keep in mind is that the confirmations, they carry more weight, because now the confirmations aren't just informing that particular segment. They're actually, each and every confirmation of any term or any segment is actually training the linguistic corpus as a whole. So in my opinion, that's a huge challenge, which is tying back the financial components into the process. But all in all, the key thing I do want to emphasize from this video is that there's a huge difference between MTPE and augmented translations. It's different in that it's significantly better, more sophisticated, dialogical, ever evolving, and it just feels organic and alive. So I highly encourage you to experience it for yourself. If you haven't tried it, don't take my word for it. And if you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.